This is a reading of Arabel's Raven by Joan Aiken, illustrated by Quentin Blake, published by Doubleday and Company Incorporated, Garden City, New York, 1974. On a stormy night in March not long ago, a respectable taxi driver named Ebenezer Jones found himself driving home, very late, through the somewhat wild and sinister district of London known as Roombury Town. Mr. Jones had just left Roombury Tube Station behind him, and was passing the long, desolate piece of land called Roombury Waste. When in the street not far ahead, he observed a large, dark, upright object. It was rather smaller than a coal hod, but bigger than a quart cider bottle, and it was moving slowly from one side of the street to the other. Mr. Jones approached within about 20 yards of this object when a motorcycle with two riders shot by him going at a reckless pace, cutting in very close. Mr. Jones braked sharply, looked in his rearview mirror. When he looked forward again, he saw that the motorcycle must have struck the upright object in passing, for it was now laying on its side just ahead of his front wheels. He brought his taxi to a halt. Not but what I dare say I'm being foolish, he thought. There's plenty in this part of town that's best left alone. But you can't see something like happen without stopping to have a look. He got out of his cab. What he found in the road was a large black bird, almost 2 feet long, with a hairy fringe around its beak. At first he thought it was dead. At his approach, however, it slightly opened one eye, then shut it again. Poor thing, it's probably stunned, thought Mr. Jones. His horoscope in the Hackney's Driver Herald that morning had said, "Due to your skills, a life will be saved today." Mr. Jones had been worrying slightly as he drove homeward, because up till now he had not, so far as he knew, saved any lives that day, except by avoiding pedestrians, however recklessly they walked into the road without looking. This'll be the life I'm due to save, he thought. Must be, for now it's 5 to midnight now. And he went back to his cab for a bottle of brandy and a teaspoon he always carried in his toolbox in case lady passengers turned faint. It's not so easy as you might believe to give brandy to a large bird lying unconscious in the street. After 5 minutes, there was a good deal of brandy on the cobbles, and some up Mr. Jones' sleeve, and some in his shoes. But he could not be sure that any had actually gone down the bird's throat. The difficulty was that he needed at least 3 hands. One to hold the bottle, one to hold the spoon, and one to hold the bird's beak open. If he pried open the beak with the handle of the teaspoon, it was sure to shut again before he had time to reverse the spoon and tip in some brandy. A hand fell on his shoulder. "Just what do you think you're doing?" inquired one of the 2 policemen. They always traveled in pairs through Roombury Town, who had left their van and were standing over him. The other police sniffed in a disapproving manner. Mr. Jones straightened slowly. "I was just giving some brandy to this rook," he explained. He was rather embarrassed because he had spilled such a lot of brandy. "Rook? It's no rook," said the other officer, who had been sniffling. "It's a raven. Look at that hairy beak." "Whatever it is, it's stunned," said Mr. Jones. "A motorcycle hit it." "Aye," said the second officer. "That'd have been one of the pair we just pinched 30,000 quid from Lloyd's Bank in High Street. It's the cash and carrot boys, the ones who've done a lot of burglaries round here lately. Did you see which way they went?" "No," said Mr. Jones, tipping up the raven's head. "But they'll have a dent on their motorcycle. Could one of you hold this bottle for me?" "You don't want to give him no brandy. Hot sweet tea's what you want to give him." "That's right," said the other police officer. "And an ice pack onto the back of his neck. Burn feathers in front of his beak. Slap his hand. Undo his shoelaces. Put him in the fridge." "He hasn't got any shoelaces," says Mr. Jones. not best pleased at all with this advice. "If you're going to hold the bottle, why don't you go on and catch the bloke that knocked him over?" "Oh, they'll be well away by now. Besides, they carry guns. We got to get back to the station," said the first police officer. "And you best not stay here giving intoxicating liquor to a bird, or we might have to take you in for loitering in a suspicious manner." "I can't just leave the bird here in the road," said Mr. Jones. "I take it with you then." "Can't you take it to the station?" "Not likely. No facilities for ravens there." They stood with arms folded, watching, while Mr. Jones slowly picked up the bird. It weighed about as much as a fox terrier and put it in his taxi. And they were still watching. He saw them in the rearview mirror as he started up and drove away. So that's how Mr. Jones happened to take the raven back with him to number 6, Rainwater Crescent, London, northwest 3.5, on a windy March night. When he got home, nobody was up, which was not surprising since it was after midnight. He would have liked to wake his daughter, Arabel, who was very fond of birds and animals. But since she was quite young and not yet school age, he thought he'd better not. And he knew he must not wake his wife, Martha, who had to be at work at Round and Round, the record shop on High Street, at 9 in the morning. He laid the raven on the kitchen floor, opened the window to give it air, put on a kettle for hot sweet tea, and while he had the match lighted, burned a feather duster under the raven's beak. Nothing happened, except that the smoke made Mr. Jones cough, and he saw no way of slapping the raven's hand or undoing its shoelaces, so he took some ice cubes and a jug of milk from the fridge. He left the fridge door open because his hands were full, and anyway, it would slowly swing shut by itself. With great care, he slid a little row of ice cubes under the back of Raven's neck. The kettle boiled, and he made the tea, a spoonful for each person and one for the pot, 3 in all. He also spread himself a slice of bread and fish bread, because he didn't see why he shouldn't have a little something, as well as the bird. He poured out a cup of tea for himself, with an egg cupful for the raven, putting plenty of sugar in both. But when he turned around, egg cup in hand, the raven was gone. "Bless me," Mr. Jones said. "That's ingratitude for you, after all my trouble. I suppose he flew out the window. Those ice cubes certainly did the trick, quick. I wonder if it would be a good notion to carry some ice cubes with me in the cab. I could put them in a vacuum flask. Might be better than brandy if a lady passenger turned faint." Thinking these thoughts, he finished his tea. And the ravens. No sense in leaving it to get cold. He turned out the light and went to bed. In the middle of the night he thought, "Did I put the milk back in the fridge?" And he thought, "No, I didn't." And he thought, "I ought to get up and put it away." And he thought, "It's a cold night. Milk's not going to turn between now and breakfast. Besides, Thursday's tomorrow. It's my early day." So he rolled over and went to sleep. Every Thursday, Mr. Jones drove the local fishmonger, Mr. Finley, over to Colchester to buy oysters at 5 in the morning. So next day, up he got, off he went, made himself a cup of tea, finished the milk in the jug, never looked in the fridge. An hour after he'd gone, which was still very early, Mrs. Jones got up in her turn and put on the kettle. Finding the milk jug empty, she went yawning to the fridge and pulled the door open, failing to notice that it had been prevented from shutting properly by the handle of a burnt feather duster, which had fallen against the hinge. But she noticed what was inside the fridge all right. She let out a shriek that brought Arabel running downstairs. Arabel was little and fair. She had gray eyes, and at the moment she was wearing a white nightdress that made her look like a lampshade with 2 feet sticking out from the bottom. One of the feet had a blue sock on. "What's the matter, Ma?" she said. "There's a great awful bird in the fridge," sobbed Mrs. Jones, "and it's eaten all the cheese and the black currant tarts and 5 pints of milk and a bowl of drippings and a pound of sausage. All that's left is lettuce." Oh, then we'll have lettuce for breakfast, said Arabel. But Mrs. Jones said she didn't fancy lettuce that had spent the night in the fridge with a great awful bird. And how are we going to get it out of there? The lettuce? The bird, said Mrs. Jones, switching off the kettle and pouring hot water into a pot without any tea in it. Arabel opened the fridge door, which had swung shut. There sat the bird, along with the empty milk bottles. But he was a lot bigger than they were. There was a certain amount of wreckage around him, torn foil and cheese wrapping and milk splashes and bits of pastry and crumbs of drippings and rejected lettuce leaves. It was like Rumsbury waste after a Sunday picnic. Arabel looked at the raven, and he looked back at her. His name's Mortimer, she said. No, it's not, cried Mrs. Jones, taking a loaf from the bread bin and absent-mindedly running the tap over it. We said you could have a hamster when you were 5 or 6, or a puppy or a kitten. When you were 6, and of course call it what you wish. Oh, my stars, look at that creature's toenails. If nails they can be called, but not a bird like that. A great hairy awful thing eating us out of house and home, as big as a fire extinguisher and all the color of a charcoal biscuit. But Arabel was looking at the raven, and he was looking back at her. His name's Mortimer, she said, and as she put her arms around the raven, not an easy thing to do, all jammed in among the milk bottles as he was, and lifted him out. He's very heavy, she said, and sat him down on the kitchen floor. So I should think, considering he's got a pound of sausages, a bowl of dripping, 5 pints of milk, half a pound of New Zealand cheddar, and a black currant tart inside of him, said Mrs. Jones. I'll open the window, perhaps he'll fly out. She opened the window, but Mortimer did not fly out. He was busy examining everything in the kitchen very thoroughly. He tapped the table legs with his beak. They were metal and clinked. Then he took everything out of the garbage bin. A pound of peanut shells, 2 Pepsi cans, and some jam tart cases. He particularly liked the jam tart cases, which he pushed under the lano. Then he walked over to the fireplace. It was an old-fashioned kitchen, and began chipping out the mortar from between the bricks. Mrs. Jones had been gazing at the raven as if she was under a spell. But when he began on the fireplace, she says, "Don't do that, Mortimer," Arabel said. "We'd like you not to do that, please." Mortimer turned his head right around on its black feathery neck and gave Arabel a thoughtful, considering look. Then he made his first remark, which was a deep croak, hoarse and rasping. "Quack." It said plain as words, "Well, all right, I won't do it this time, but I make no promises that I won't do it again sometime, but I think you are being unreasonable." "Wouldn't you like to see the rest of the house, Mortimer?" said Arabel, and she held open the kitchen door. Mortimer walked. He never hopped. Very slowly through the hall, and he looked at the stairs. They seemed to interest him greatly, and he began going up them, hand over hand, or rather, beak over claw. When he was halfway up, the telephone rang. It stood on the windowsill at the foot of the stairs, and Mortimer watched as Mrs. Jones came to answer it. Mr. Jones was ringing from Colchester to ask if his wife wanted any oysters. "Oysters," she said. "That bird you left in the fridge has eaten sausages, cheese, drippings, black currant tart, drunk 5 pints of milk, and now he's chewing the stairs. And you ask if I want oysters. Perhaps I should feed him caviar as well." "Bird I left in the fridge," Mr. Jones was puzzled. "What bird, Martha?" "That great black crow, or whatever it is. Arabel calls it Mortimer. And she's leaning all over the house, and now it's taken all the spools of thread from my sewing drawer and is pushing them under the doormat." "Not it, Ma. He. Mortimer," said Arabel, going to open the front door and take the letters from the mailbox. But Mortimer got there first and received the letters in his beak. The mailman was so startled that he dropped his whole sack of mail in a puddle and gasped, "Nevermore. Will I stay later than 10:30 at Oddfellow's ball, or touch a drop stronger than Caribbean lemon, and never more. Never more, said Mortimer, pushing 2 bills and a postcard under the doormat. Then he retrieved the postcard again by spearing it clean through the middle. Mrs. Jones let out a wail. Arabel, will you come in out of the street in your nightie? Look what that bird's done, chewing up the gas bills, nevermore indeed. I should just about say it was nevermore. No, I don't want oysters, which brings me out in raised red irritations and hiccups, as you know, Ebenezer Jones, and always have. And please shut the front door and stop that bird from pushing all those plastic flowers under the stair carpet. Mr. Jones could make nothing of this at all, so he hung up. 5 minutes later, the telephone rang again. This time, it was Mrs. Jones' sister Brenda, to ask if Martha would like to come to a bingo drive that evening. But Mortimer got there first. He picked up the receiver with his claw, exactly as he'd seen Mrs. Jones do, delivered a loud clicking noise into it, click, and said, nevermore, and then he replaced the receiver. My lord, Brenda said to her husband, Ben and Martha must have had a terrible quarrel. He answered the phone, didn't sound a bit like himself. Meanwhile, Mortimer had climbed upstairs and was in the bathroom trying the faucets. It took him less than 5 minutes to work out how to turn them on. He liked to watch the cold water running, but the hot with its steam of cloud for some reason annoyed him, and he began throwing things at the hot faucets. Bits of soap, sponges, nail brushes, face cloths. They choked up the plug hole, and presently there was a flood. Mortimer, I think you better not stay in the bathroom, Arabel said. Mortimer was good at giving people black looks. Now he gave Arabel one. But she had a red truck, which had once been filled with wooden building bricks. The bricks had long ago been scattered and lost, but the truck was in good repair. Mortimer, would you like to ride in this red truck? Mortimer thought he would. He climbed into the truck and stood there, waiting. When Mrs. Jones discovered Arabel pulling Mortimer along on the truck, she nearly had a fit. Well, it's not bad enough that you adore that big, ugly, sulky bird, but now you have to pull him along on a truck. Don't his legs work? Why can't he walk, may I ask? He doesn't feel like walking now, Arabel said. Of course, and I suppose he's forgotten how to fly. I'd like pulling him in the truck, said Arabel, and she pulled him into the garden. Presently, Mrs. Jones went off to work at Round and Round, the record shop, and Granny came in to look after Arabel. All Granny ever did was sit and knit. She didn't mind answering the phone, but every time it rang, Mortimer got there first, picked up the receiver, and said, nevermore. People who had called up for a taxi were puzzled and said to one another, Mr. Jones must have retired. Lunch was baked beans. Mortimer enjoyed the baked beans, but his table manners were very light-hearted. He liked knocking spoons and forks off the table, pushing them under the sisal matting, and fetching them out again with a lot of excitement. Granny wasn't so keen on this. While Granny was having her nap, Arabel looked at the funnies and Mortimer looked at the stairs. There seemed to be something about stairs that appealed to him. When Mr. Jones came home at tea time, the first thing he said was, What happened to the 3 bottom steps? What has, then? Granny, short-sighted and, anyway, busy spreading jam. They aren't there. It wasn't Mortimer's fault, said Arabel. He didn't know we needed stairs. Mortimer? Who's Mortimer? Just then Mrs. Jones came home. That bird has got to go, said Mr. Jones, the minute she had put down her shopping basket and taken off her coat. Who's talking? You're the one who left him in the fridge. Mortimer looked morose and sulky at Mr. Jones's words. He sank his head between his shoulders and ruffled up the beard around his beak, and turned his toes in as if he did not care one way or another. But Arabel went so white that her father thought she was going to faint. If Mortimer goes, she said, I shall cry all the time. Very likely I shall die. Oh, well, said Mr. Jones, but mind if he stays, he'll not eat any more stairs. Just the same, during the next week or so, Mortimer did chew up 6 more stairs. The family had to go to bed by climbing a ladder. Luckily, it was an aluminum fruit ladder, or Mortimer probably have chewed it up too. He was very fond of timber. There was a bit of trouble because he wanted to sleep in the fridge at night, but Mrs. Jones put a stop to that. In the end, he agreed to sleep in the airing cupboard. Then there was a bit more trouble because he pushed all the soap and toothbrushes onto the bathroom lino. They had to get in the fire brigade to climb through the window as the bathroom door wouldn't open. "He's not to be left alone in the house," said Mr. Jones. "On the days when Arabel goes to playgroup, Martha, he'll have to go to work with you." "Why can't he come to playgroup with me?" Arabel asked. Mr. Jones laughed at that question. Mrs. Jones was not enthusiastic about taking Mortimer to work with her. "So I'll just pull him up to the high street on that red truck." "You must be joking." "He can ride on your shopping bag on wheels," Arabel said. "He'll like that." At first, the owners of the record shop, Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round, were quite pleased to have Mortimer sitting on the counter. People who lived in Rumberry Town heard about the Raven. They came in out of curiosity, and then they played records, and then as often as not, bought them. And at first Mortimer was so astonished at the music, he'd sit on the counter for hours at a time looking at a stuffed bird. At tea time, when Arabel came home from playgroup, she told him what she'd been doing and pulled him around on the red truck. Several other shops in Rumberry Town were burgled. Brown's the ironmonger, Mr. Finney the fishmonger, and Tutti Frutti's candy shop. Mr. Jones found a carpenter who said he would come along on Sunday week and mend the stairs. Everything seemed to be going all right. But presently, Mortimer began to get bored by just sitting and listening to music. There was a telephone on the counter. One day when it rang, Mrs. Jones was wrapping up a record for a customer, so Mortimer got there first. "Can you tell me the name of the new Weevils LP?" said a voice. "Nevermore," said Mortimer. Also, Mortimer began taking triangular bites out of the edges of records. After that, it wasn't so easy to sell them. Then he noticed the spiral stairs which led down to the classic and folk department. One morning, Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round and Mrs. Jones were all very busy arranging a display of new issues in the shop window. When they had finished, they discovered that Mortimer had eaten the spiral staircase. "Mrs. Jones, you and your bird will have to go. We have kind, long-suffering natures, but Mortimer has done £817 72 worth of damage. You may have a year to repay it. Please don't trouble to come in for the rest of this week." "Glad I am having such a kind, long-suffering nature," snapped Mrs. Jones, and she dumped Mortimer on top of her wheeled shopping bag and dragged him home. "Stairs," she said to Arabel. "What's the use of a bird who eats stairs? Gracious knows, there's enough rubbish in the world. Why can't he eat soda bottles or ice cream cartons or used cars or oil slicks? Tell me that. But no, he has to eat the only thing that joins the upstairs to the downstairs." "Nevermore," said Mortimer. "Tell that to the space cavalry," said Mrs. Jones. Arabel and Mortimer went and sat side by side on the bottom rung of the fruit ladder, leaning against one another, very quiet. "When I'm grown up," Arabel said to Mortimer, "we can live in a house with 100 stairs and you can eat them all." Next day, Mrs. Jones found another job at Peter Stone, the jewelers, in High Street. She had to take both Arabel and Mortimer with her to work, since playgroup was finished until after Easter, and Granny had gone to South End on a visit. Arabel pulled Mortimer to the shop every day in a red truck. Peter Stone, the jeweler, had no objections. The more people in the shop, the less chance of a hold-up, he said. Too much we're hearing about those cash and carrot boys for my taste. Raided the supermarket yesterday, they did. Took 2,000 cans of the best Jamaican blend coffee, and the cash box was jammed. Coffee? What would they want with 2,000 cans? Perhaps they were thirsty, Arabel said. She and Mortimer were looking at their reflections in a glass case full of bracelets. Mortimer tapped the glass in an experimental way with his beak. "That bird now," Peter Stone said, giving Mortimer a thoughtful look. "He'll behave himself. He won't go swallowing any diamonds. That brooch he's looking at now is worth 40,000 pounds. Mrs. Jones drew herself up. "Behave himself. Naturally he'll behave himself," she said. "Any diamonds he swallows I'll guarantee to replace." A police sergeant came into the shop. "I've got a message for your husband," he said to Mrs. Jones. "We found a motorcycle, and we'd be glad if he'd step up to the station and see if I can identify it as the one that passed him the night the bank was robbed." Then he saw Mortimer. "Is that the bird that got knocked over? He better come along as well, where I can see if he fits the dent on the gas tank." "Nevermore," said Mortimer, who was eyeing a large gold clock, but it was under a glass dome. "He'd better not talk like that to the super," the sergeant said, "or he'll be charged with obstructing the police." "Have they got any theories about the identity of the gang?" Peter Stone asked. "No, they always wear masks, but we're pretty sure they're locals and have a hideout somewhere in the district, because we always lose track of them so fast. One odd feature is they have a small accomplice about the size of that bird there," the sergeant said, giving Mortimer a hard stare. "How do you know?" "Well, when they robbed the supermarket, someone got in through the manager's cat door, opened a window from inside. If birds had fingerprints," the sergeant said, "I wouldn't mind taking the prints of that shifty-looking fowl. He could get through a cat flap easy enough." "Crack," said Mortimer. "Your opinions are uncalled for," said Mrs. Jones. "Thoughtless old Mortimer may be untidy at times, but honest as a bath bun, I'll have you know. And the night the supermarket was robbed, he was in our airing cupboard with his head tucked under his wing." "I've known some bath buns not all they should be," said the sergeant. 5 minutes after the sergeant had gone, Peter Stone went off for his lunch. And 5 minutes after that, 2 masked men walked into the shop. One of them pointed a gun at Mrs. Jones and Arabel. The other smashed a glass case and took out the diamond brooch, which Peter Stone said was worth 40,000 pounds. Out of the gunman's pocket clambered a gray squirrel with an extremely villainous expression, which looked hopefully around. "Nothing for you to take here, Sam," said the masked man, who had taken the diamond. "Piece of apple pie, this job." The squirrel seemed disappointed, but the man with gun said, "Don't be stupid. Give Sam the brooch, and he can use the bird. Ha ha! He can hitch a ride out of our snuggery. I've a score to settle with that bird anyway." Mortimer, who was eating one of the cheese sandwiches Mrs. Jones brought for her lunch, suddenly found a gun jammed into his ribs. The squirrel jumped up on his back. "You'd better cooperate, cold face," the gunman said. "This is a fly, Jack. Fly where Sam tells you, you'll be blown to 40 bits. Sam carries a bomb around his neck on a shoelace. All he has to do is pull out the pin with his teeth. "Oh, please don't blow up Mortimer," Arabel said to the gunman. "I think he's forgotten how to fly." "He'd better be pretty fast." "Oh, dear Mortimer, perhaps you'd better do what they say." With a croak that could be heard all over the jeweler's shop, Mortimer unfolded his wings, and to his own surprise as much as anyone else, flew out through the open door with Sam sitting on his back. The 2 thieves calmly walked after him. As soon as they were gone, Mrs. Jones went into hysterics. Arabel rang the alarm buzzer. In no time the police car bounced to a stop outside, with sirens screaming and lights flashing. Peter Stone came rushing back from the scampi bar. Mrs. Jones was still having hysterics, but Arabel said, "2 masked gunmen stole a diamond brooch and gave it to a squirrel to carry away, and he's flown off on Mortimer, who's all raving. Please get him back." "Where'd the 2 men go?" "They just walked off up the high street." "All sounds like a fishy tale to me," said the police sergeant. "It was the same one who had been in earlier. You sure you didn't give the brooch to the bird and tell him to flit off with it to the nearest fence?" "Oh, how could you say such a thing?" wept Mrs. Jones. Want our Mortimer, the best-hearted raven in Rumsbury Town, even if he doesn't look a bit sour at times." "Any clues?" said the sergeant to his men. "There's a trail of cheese crumbs here," said a constable. "We'll see how far we can follow them." The police left, following the trail of cheese, which led all the way to Rumbury High Street, past the bank, past the fishmonger, past the supermarket, past the ironmonger, past the record shop, past the war memorial, and stopped at the tube station. "He's done us," said the sergeant. "Went on by train. Did a large back bird buy a ticket to anywhere about 10 minutes ago?" he asked Miss Grumble, the ticket clerk. "No." "He could have gotten a ticket from a machine," one of the constables pointed out. "They all say out of order. Anyway, why should a bird buy a ticket? He could just fly into a train." Said another constable. All the passengers who had traveled on the Rumberloo line that morning were asked if they had seen a large black bird or a squirrel carrying a diamond brooch. None of them had. "Please, no offense, Mrs. Jones," said Peter Stone, "but these doubtful circumstances, I'd just as soon you didn't come back after lunch. We'll say nothing about the £40,000 for the brooch at present. Let's hope that bird isn't caught with it on him." "He didn't take it," said Arabel. "You'll find out." Arabel and Mrs. Jones walked home to number 6 Rainwater Crescent. Arabel was pale and silent, but Mrs. Jones scolded all the way. "Any bird with a scrap of gumption would have taken the brooch off that wretched little rat of a squirrel. Ashamed of himself, ought to be. Nothing but trouble and aggravation we've had since Mortimer's been in the family. Let's hope that's the last of him." Arabel said she didn't want any tea and went to bed, and cried herself to sleep. When he finished work that evening, Mr. Jones went up to the police station and identified the motorcycle as the one that had passed him the night the bank had been robbed. "How can you be sure it's the same?" the sergeant asked. "Oh, the pink flower sticker on the rear fender." "Good," said the sergeant. "We found a couple of black feathers stuck to the tank. If you ask me, that bird's up to its beak in this murky business." "How could it be?" Mr. Jones said. "He just went crossing the road when the motorcycle went by." "Maybe they slipped him some cash as he passed." "In that case, we'd seen it, wouldn't we? Do you know who the motorcycle belongs to?" "It was found abandoned on the Rumberloo line embankment, where it comes out of the tunnel. We've a theory, but I'm not telling you, and your family's under suspicion. Don't leave the district without informing us." Mr. Jones said he had no intention of leaving. "We want Mortimer found. My daughter's very upset." Arabel, who was more than upset, she was in despair. She wandered around the house all day looking at the things that reminded her of Mortimer. The fireplace bricks without any mortar, the tattered hearthrug, the plates with beak-sized chips missing, the chewed upholstery, all the articles that turned up under carpets and lino, and the missing stairs. The carpenter hadn't yet come to replace them, and Mr. Jones was too dejected to nag him. "I wouldn't have thought I'd get so fond of a bird so quick," he said. "I miss his sulky face, and his thoughtful ways, and the sound of him crunching up the house." "Eat up your tea, Arabel dearie, that's a good girl. I expect Mortimer will find his way home by and by." But Arabel couldn't eat. Tears ran down her nose and onto her bread and jam until it was all soggy. That reminded her of the flood that Mortimer had caused by blocking up the bathroom plug, and the tears rolled even faster. "Mortimer doesn't know our address," she said. "He doesn't even know our name." "We'll offer £5 reward for his return." "£5!" cried Mrs. Jones, who had just come home from the supermarket, where she now worked. £5 you offer for the return of that fiend, when already we owe £817, 72 pence to Round and Round, let alone the 40,000 to Peter Stone. The only thing that makes me thankful is that bird doesn't have to come with me to the supermarket." "Just the same, Mr. Jones, stuck up his reward sign in the sub-post office alongside one from Peter Stone offering £1,000 for information that might lead to the return of his brooch. Similar ones from the bank, ironmonger, and fishmonger. Meanwhile, what of Mortimer and the squirrel? They had flown as far as the tube station. There, Sam, by kicking Mortimer's ribs, punching the top of his head, had directed him to fly into the station entrance. Rumsbury tube station is very old, and the two entrances have big round arches with sliding open-work iron gates. And the station is faced all over with shiny raw meat-colored tiles. A dark blue enamel sign says London General Omnibus and Subterranean Railway Company by appointment to His Majesty King Edward the Seventh. For nearly 50 years, there had only been one slow, creaky old lift to take people down to the trains. A sign on it said, "Not authorized to carry more than 12 passengers." People, too impatient to wait for it, had to walk down about 1,000 spiral stairs. But lately, the station had been modernized by the addition of a handsome pair of escalators, one up and one down, which replaced the spiral stairs. Nothing else was modern. The ticket machines were so old that people said they would work only for a Queen Victoria bun penny. The bookstall was always shut and had copies of the Morning Post for August 4th, 1914, covered in dust. The candy machines had been empty for generations, and down below, as well as on the old train platforms, there was all kind of mysterious old galleries. From the days when trams still ran in London, it had been an underground tramway station connecting with Kingsway, Aldwych, and Spurgeon's Tabernacle line. Not many trains stop at Rumsbury Station. Most of them rush straight through from Nutmeg Hill to Cannon's Green. Old Mr. Grumbel, the ticket clerk, was Mrs. Joan's uncle. Besides selling tickets, he also ran the lift. He was too short-sighted to see across to the lift from the ticket office, so he used to count tickets. When he had sold 12, he would lock up his office and take the lift down. This meant that sometimes people had to wait a very long time, but it didn't much matter, as there probably wouldn't be a train for hours anyway. However, in the end, there were still complaints, which was why the escalators were installed. Mr. Grumble enjoyed riding on these, which he had called escalator's. He used to leave the lift at the bottom and travel back up the moving stairs. He did this today. He ran the lift slowly down, never noticing that Mortimer, with Sam the squirrel still grimly clutching him, was perched high up near the ceiling on the frame of a poster advertising the Pickwick, the Owl, and the Waverley Pen. Mr. Grumble left the lift at the bottom and sailed up the escalator, mumbling to himself, these moving stairs do be an amazing wonder of science. What'll ever they think of next?" When Mr. Grumble got to the top again, he found the police there, examining the trail of cheese crumbs, which stopped outside the station entrance. They stayed a long time, but Mr. Grumble could give them no useful information. "Birds and squirrels," he muttered, when they had gone. "It's likely you be seeing a bird and a squirrel with diamond brooches in a tube station." The phone rang. There was only one telephone in the station, a public phone booth with the door missing. So if people wanted to call Mr. Grumble, which did not often happen, they rang that line. This time, it was Mr. Jones. "Is that you, Uncle Arthur?" "Of course it's me. Who else would it be?" "We just wondered if you've seen Arabel's raven. The trail of cheese crumbs led up your way," the police said. "I haven't seen a raven," snapped Mr. Grumble. "Cops are bothering here all afternoon, but I still haven't. Nor have I seen a Socrates bird, nor a crocodile, or a peterwari. It's a tube station, not a zoological garden." "Will you keep a looking just the same?" Mr. Jones said. Mr. Grumble thumped back the receiver. He was fed up with all the bother. "Do I wait here any longer?" he said to himself. "Likely the militia and the beef goers and the horse eaters and traffic wardens will be along too. I'm closing up." Rumsbury Station was not supposed to be closed except between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. But in fact, old Mr. Grumble often did close it earlier if his bad toe was bothering him. No one complained yet. Even if me tail ain't aching now, likely they'll start any minute now with all this wool caulking about, Mr. Grumble argued to himself, and so he switched off the escalators, locked the lift gates and the ticket office, turned off the lights, called up Nutmeg Hill and Cannon's Green to tell them not to let any trains stop, padlocked the big main mesh gates, and stomped off home to supper. Next morning, there were several people waiting to catch the first trains to work. Mr. Grumble arrived to open it. They bustled in as soon as he slid the gates back, and didn't stop at the tickets office, for they all had season tickets. But when they reached the top of the escalator, they did stop, in dismay and astonishment, for the escalators were not there. Nothing but a big, gaping black hole. "Someone's pinched the stairs," said a Covent Garden porter. "Don't be so soft. How could you pinch an escalator?" said a milkman. "Well, they're going, aren't they?" said a bus driver. "What's your theory? Earthquake? Sunk into the ground? Squatters?" said a train driver. "Mark my words, squatters have taken them." "How'd they get through the lock gates anyway?" "What'd they take them for?" "To squat on, of course." Mr. Grumble stood scratching his head. "Take my escalator's," he said sorrowful. What did they want to go and do that for? "If they'd have took the lift now, I wouldn't have minded near as much." "Well, all you lot'll have to go down the lift anyways. Ain't 12 of you, so it's all right." It wasn't all right, though. When he pulled the lever that should have brought the lift to the surface, nothing happened. "And I'll tell you why," said the train driver, peering through the closed top gates. "Someone's been and chawed through the lift cable." "Sawed through it?" "No, could have chewed or haggled through. Real messy job. Luckily the current was switched off, or whoever's done it would have been fizzled like popcorn." "Someone's been sabotaging the station," said the bus driver. "Football fans is my guess." "Hippies more like it. Someone ought to tell the cops." "Cops? Cops," grumbled Mr. Grumble. "Not likely. Had enough of them yesterday scabs around here looking for a brave squirrel." Another reason why he did not want to tell the police was because he was shy about mentioning that he had left the station unattended for so long. But the early travelers, finding they could not get the train here, walked off to the next stop down the line, Nutmeg Hill. They told their friends at work what happened, and the story spread about. Presently, a reporter from the Rumsbury Borough News rang up the tube station for confirmation of the tale. "Is that Rumsbury tube station? Can you tell me, please, if the trains are running normally?" "Nevermore," croaked a harsh voice, and the receiver was thumped down. "You'd better go up there and have a look around," said Borough News editor, when his reporter told him of this puzzling conversation. So the reporter, whose name was Dick Otter, took a bus up to the tube station. It was a dark, drizzly, foggy day, and when he peered in through the station entrance, he thought it looked like a cave inside. Under the round arches, the ticket machines with their dim little lights were like stalagmites. The white tiled floor was like a sheet of ice. The empty green candy machines were like the hanks of moss dangling against the walls. And old Mr. Grumble, with his white whiskers seated in the ticket booth, was like a wizened goblin with little piles of magic cards telling people where they should go. "Is your station open?" Dick asks. "You walked in, didn't you? But you can't go anywhere," said Mr. Grumble. Dick went over and looked at the gaping hole where the escalators used to be. Mr. Grumble had hung a couple of chains across to stop people from falling down. Then Dick peered through lift gates down the shaft. Then he went back to Mr. Grumble, who was reading yesterday's football results by the light of a candle. It was very dark in the station entrance because nearly all the light switches were down below, and Mr. Grumble could not get at them. "Who do you think took the escalators?" Dick asked, getting out his notebook. Mr. Grumble had been thinking about this a good deal on and off during the morning. "Spooks," he replied. "Spooks? What doesn't like modern inventions? I reckon the station's haunted. I've been sitting here all morning. There's a ghostly voice what sometimes comes and croaks in me lung hole. 'Nevermore,' it says, 'nevermore.' There's one reason why I haven't informed the cops. What could they do? What that voice means is this station shall nevermore be used." "I see," said Dick thoughtfully. In his notebook he wrote, Is tube station haunted, or is ticket clerk round the bend? What else makes you think it's haunted, he asked. Well, Mr. Grumble said, there couldn't be anybody downstairs, could there? I was locked up last night when it was 9 o'clock south had gone. And I phoned them up at Neckmig Hill and Cannon Green not to let any train stop here till I give 'em a word again. No one would have gone round the end after that, and yet some thinks I think I can hear voices down the lift shaft calling out, help, help, which is a contradiction of nature, since, like I said, no one could be down there. Supposing they'd gone down last night before you locked up, then they'd have caught a 9 o'clock south, wouldn't they? No, 'tis ghosties down there, all right. Whose ghost do you think? 'Tis the ghost of the old tramcar drivers. Why do I think that? Well, look at these here tickets. Mr. Grumble showed a pile of green 15-penny tube tickets. Each had a large triangular snip taken from one side. See, a ghostie did that, he said triumphantly. Who else could have got to my ticket office? The only way in was through the slot, see, where the passengers pay their fares. A human couldn't get through there, but a ghostie could. It was a ghostie of one of them old tramcar conductors a hankering to clip a ticket again like in the bygone days, see? And the same ghostie pinched me ham sandwich, all been saving for me breakfast, and left nap but crumbs. That's why I haven't rung that office. Neither, 'cause what would be the use? If they didn't put in a pair of new escalators and fix the lift, the new ones be gone again by the next day. That's what the voice means when it says, nevermore. You think you can hear voices crying, help, help, down the shaft, Dick went and listened, but there was nothing to be heard at the moment. Luckily, I'm the only one can hear him, said Mr. Grumble. Seems to me I can smell something, though, Dick said, sniffing. Up from the lift shaft floated the usual smell of tube station, a queer, warm, dusty, metallic smell, like powdered ginger. But as well as that, there was another smell, fragrant and tantalizing. Smells to me like coffee, Dick said. There you are, then, cried Mr. Grumble triumphantly. Them old tramcar drivers used to brew up a big old pot when they was waiting for the last train back to Brixton of the night time. I'd like to get some pictures of the station, said Dick, and he went over to the public phone booth and dialed his office to get a photographer. But as he waited with a 10-pence in his hand, ready to put it in the slot, when the pips went, something large and black suddenly wafted past his head in the gloom, and snatched the receiver from him, and whispered harshly in his ear, nevermore. Next day, Rumberry Borough News had headlines. Is our tube station haunted? Mr. Grumble, ticket collector and clerk here for the last 40 years, asserts that it is. Ghosts of old-time tram drivers sit downstairs, he said, playing dominoes and drinking licorice water. Dick Otter had phoned his story from the phone booth into the sub-post office, and the girl in the newsroom had misheard drinking coffee as drinking toffee, which she rightly thought was nonsense, so she changed it to drinking licorice water. Shan't be able to meet people's eyes in the street, said Mr. Jones at breakfast. Going balmy, your uncle. Arthur is, without a doubt, haunted police station. Take him along to see the doctor, shall I? The postman rang with a special delivery from a firm of lawyers. Mrs. Gumby, Harbottle, Ink Pen and Rule. Dear Madam, it is said, acting as solicitors for Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round, we wish to know when it will be convenient for you to pay £817.72 worth of damages that you owe our clients for destruction of premise. This threw Mrs. Jones into a dreadful flutter. That I should have to live to see another day when we are turned out of house and home on account of a bad-tempered fiend of a bird fetched off in the street by my own husband and dragged about on a red wooden wagon by my own daughter. Well, you haven't lived to see the day yet, said Mr. Jones. Wild creatures, ravens, are counted in as law, so we can't be held responsible by the bird's action. I'll go around and tell him, and you'd better do something to cheer up Arabel. I've never seen the child so thin and mopey. He drove his taxi to Round and Round, the record shop, but strangely enough, neither Mr. Round nor Mr. Toby Round was to be seen. The place was locked, silent and dusty. After trying to persuade Arabel to eat her breakfast, which was no use, as Arabel wouldn't touch it, Mrs. Jones decided to call Uncle Arthur to tell him he should see a doctor for his nerves. She called up the tube station, but the telephone rang and nobody answered. In fact, the reason for this was the great many sightseers, having read the piece of the Borough News, who'd come to stare at the station. And Mr. Grumble was having a fine time telling all about the ways of the old tram car drivers. While Mrs. Jones was still holding the telephone and listening to the bell ring, another bell rang, louder, the front door. "Trouble, trouble, nothing but trouble," grumbled Mrs. Jones. "Here, Arabel, lovely, hold the phone and say hello to Uncle Arthur. Mom wants to speak to you. If he answers, will you? Well, I see who's at the front door." Arabel took the receiver, and Mrs. Jones went to the front door, where there were 2 police officers. She let out a screech. "It's no use that pair of sharks sending you to arrest me for 817 pounds I haven't got. If you were to turn me upside down and shake me till September." The police looked puzzled, and one of them said, "I reckon there's some mistake. We don't want to turn you upside down. We came to ask if you recognize this." He held out a small object in the palm of his hands. Mrs. Jones had a close look at it. "Why, I certainly do. That's Mr. Round's tie pin, the one that he made out of his back teeth when it fell out eating a plate of Irish stew." Meanwhile, Arabel was still sitting on the stairs holding the phone to her ear, when all at once she heard a hoarse whisper. "Nevermore." Arabel was so astonished that she almost dropped the telephone. She looked all around her, nobody there. Then she looked back at the phone, but it had gone silent again. After a minute, a different voice barked. "Who's that?" "Hello, Uncle Arthur, it's me, Arabel. Mom wants to speak to you." "Well, I don't want to speak to her," said Mrs. Grumble, and he hung up. Arabel sat on the stairs and said to herself, "That was Mortimer, and he must be up the tube station because of where Uncle Arthur is." Arabel had often traveled by tube and knew the way to the station. She got her red truck, and she put on her thick, woolly, warm jacket, and she went out the back door because Mother was still at the front, and Arabel didn't want to be stopped. She walked up the high street past the bank. The manager looked out and said to himself, "That child's too young to be out on her own. I'll better follow her and find out who she belongs to." He started after her. Next, Arabel passed by the supermarket. The manager looked out and said to himself, "That's Mrs. Jones' little girl. I'll just nip after her and ask her where her mother's got today." So he followed Arabel. Then she passed the Round and Round record shop, but there was nobody in it, and Mrs. Jones had become tired of waiting and driven off in his taxi. Then she passed Peter Stone, the jeweler. Peter Stone saw her through the window and thought, "That girl looks as if she knows where she means to go, and she was the only one who showed any sense after my burglary. Maybe it's a true story about the squirrel and the raven. Anyway, no harm following her to see where she goes." So he locked up his shop and followed. Arabel passed the fire station. Usually the firemen waved at her. They had been friendly ever since they'd had to come and climb the Joneses' bathroom window. But today they were all hastily pulling on their helmets and rushing about. And just as she had passed on, the fire engine shot out into the street, going lickety-split. Presently, Arabel came to the tube station. The first person she saw there was her great-aunt, Annie Gumbrel. "Arabel Jones, what are you doing walking up High Street by yourself, liable to get run over, and kidnapped, and murdered, and abducted, and worse? The idea! Where's your mother, and where are you going?" "I'm looking for Mortimer," said Arabel, and she kept on going. "I've stayed on the same side all the way. I didn't have to cross over," she said over her shoulder as she went to the tube station. Auntie Anne had come up to the station to tell Uncle Arthur that they were behaving foolishly and had better come home. But she couldn't get near him because of that crowd. In fact, Arabel was the only person who could get into the station entrance now because she was so small, and there was just room for her. And then the place was completely jammed. Auntie Annie wasn't able to get in at all. When Arabel was inside, someone kindly picked her up and set her on top of a 5-penny ticket machine. so that she could see. "What's happening?" she asked. "They reckon somebody's stuck in a lift down at the bottom, so they're going to send a fireman, and he'll go in through the trap door in the roof of the lift and fetch him back up," said Great Uncle Arthur, who happened to be standing by her. I told 'em 'tis ghosties of the old tram drivers, but they don't take no notice." "Why don't they just take a train from Nutmeg Hill, stop down below? Someone who from it can go to see what the matter is. Train drivers' union won't let 'em stop. They say if 'tis ghosties of old tram drivers stuck in the lift, 'tis a different union and no concern of theirs." Now the fireman, who had been taking a careful look at the lift, asked everyone to please step out of the street to make room. Then they rigged up a light, because the station was so dark, and they brought in a mini helicopter, which was mostly used for rescuing people who got stuck in church spires or in the roofs of burning buildings. But they had got worked out that it would be just the right size to get in the little shaft if the pilot steered with care. So down it went, the whole population of Rumsbury town by now standing in the street outside. Whew, and held their breath. Presently, a shout came from below. "They found someone," said the fireman, and everybody said, "Coo!" again and held their breath some more. Just at this moment, Arabel, still sitting on the 5-penny ticket machine, for she was in no one's way there, felt a thump on her right shoulder. It was lucky that she had put on her thick woolly coat, for 2 claws took hold of her shoulder with a grip like a bulldog clip, and a loving croak in her ear said, "Nevermore!" "Mortimer!" cried Arabel, and she was so pleased that she might have toppled off the ticket machine if Mortimer hadn't spread out his wings like a tightrope walker's umbrella and balanced them both. Mortimer was just as pleased to see Arabel as she was to see him. When he had them both balanced, he wrapped his left-hand wing around her and said, "Nevermore," 5 or 6 times in tones of great satisfaction and enthusiasm. "Look, Mortimer, they're bringing someone up." The mini helicopter had room for only one passenger at a time. Up it crept, buzzing like a mosquito, dangling by the lift shaft. And who should climb out but Mr. Toby Round, looking hungry and sorry for himself. The minute he was landed, all sorts of helpful people, St. John's ambulance men, stretcher bearers, clergymen, and matron of the Rumsbury Hospital, all rushed at him with bandages and cups of tea and said, "Are you all right?" They would have taken him away, but he said he wanted to wait for his brother. The minicopter had gone down again at once. In a minute it came up with the other Mr. Round. As soon as he landed, he noticed Arabel and Mortimer perched on the ticket machine, and the sight of them seemed to set him in a passion. "Grab that bird," he shouted. "He's the cause of all this trouble. Gnawed through the lift cable, ate the escalator, and had my brother and me trapped in utter discomfort for 48 hours. "And what you a doing down there?" said Mr. Grumble suspiciously, after the 9 o'clock South had come and gone. Just at this moment, a whole truckload of police officers arrived with Mrs. Jones, who seemed half distracted. "There you are!" she screamed when she saw Arabel. And me, nearly frantic. "Oh my goodness, there's that great awful bird, as if we didn't have enough to worry about." But the police swarmed about the Round brothers, and the sergeant said, "I have a warrant to arrest you two on suspicion of having pinched cash from the bank last month. And if you want to know why we think it's you that did it, it's because we found your tooth tie pin left behind in the safe, and one of Toby's fingerprints on the abandoned motorcycle. And I shouldn't wonder if you did the jobs at the supermarket, and the jewelries, and all the others." "It's not true," shouted Mr. Toby Round. "We didn't do it. We didn't do any of them. We were staying with my sister-in-law at Rumsford on each occasion. Her name's Mrs. Flossie Wilkes, and she lives at 2001 Station Approach. And if you ask my opinion, that raven is the thief." But the sergeant had pulled Mr. Toby Round's hand from his pocket to put a handcuff on it, and when he did so, what should come out but Sam the Squirrel? And what should Sam be clutching in his paws but Mr. Peter Stone's diamond brooch worth 40,000 pounds. So everybody said, "Coo!" again, and Mr. Round and Mr. Toby Round were taken off to Rumberry Hill Police Station. The police sergeant hitched a ride in the fireman's minicopter and went down the lift and had a look around the old galleries and disused train station, and he found the money that had been stolen from the bank, all packed in plastic garbage cans that had been stolen from the Browns' ironmonger, and he found 199 of the 2,000 cans of the best Jamaican coffee stolen from the supermarket, and a whole lot of other things that had been stolen from different premises all over Rumsbury town. While he was making these exciting discoveries down below, up above, Mrs. Jones was saying, "Arabel, you come home directly, and don't you dare go out ever again." "Never more," said Mortimer. So Arabel climbed down with Mortimer still on her shoulder. "Yeah," said Uncle Arthur, who'd been silent for a long time, turning things over in his mind. "That bird ought to be arrested too if he's the one what ate more escalators and put more lift out of order. How do we know he didn't help them blokes with the burglaries? He's the one that helped the squirrel make off with the diamond brooch." "He was flyjacked. He couldn't help it," said Arabel. "Far from being arrested," said the bank manager, "he'll get a reward from the bank for helping to bring the criminals to justice. And maybe he'll get one from me, too," said Peter Stone. "And from me," said the supermarket manager. "Come along, Arabel," said Mrs. Jones. "Oh, my gracious, look at the time. Your father will be home wanting his tea, wondering what in the world we've got to." Arabel collected her red truck, which she had left outside, and Mortimer climbed onto it. "My stars!" cried Mrs. Jones. "You're not going to pull that great black sulky bird all the way home on a truck when we know perfectly well he can fly. The lazy thing, never did I hear anything so outrageous, never." "He likes being pulled," said Arabel. So that was the way they went home. The bank manager and the supermarket manager and Mr. Peter Stone and quite a lot of other people saw them as far as the gate. Mr. Jones was inside, and he had just made a pot of tea. When he saw them come in the front gate, he poured out an eggful for Mortimer.